Welcome to The Chat. Come behind the inbound scenes of some of the world's fastest growing companies. For the past 10 years as Chatmetrics, we've had an exclusive inside view of how these industry leaders are revolutionising inbound marketing and sales across diverse sectors. Each week, we bring you conversations with top minds in marketing and sales who share insider secrets and strategies for driving inbound success. Join us on The Chat, your front row seat to the future of inbound. Now join us on The Chat as we continue our conversation with Ellza Malok. The underlying component in nearly all of the things we've been talking about has been, behavioral science and psychology. It all comes down to the fact that I think as human beings, as much as we can learn about psychology, I think we're still only scratching the surface because people are constantly surprising.
Yeah, there's this concept that I've kind of stolen from a number of writers, specifically around predictable irrationality, and as emotional and often not as organized as we potentially would like to be, and as sentient as we think humans are, there are some patterns. It's just a very complex pattern. And I think behavioral science is kind of the window into, pulling some of that, those nerves and those that web into something a little bit more legible. For it. It's so interesting to kind of see different elements, and then because we're humans and we constantly human, there's elements of cultural changes that shift that behavior, and there's societal and all these other elements that we have to kind of take into consideration. But my whole thought process was, well, if we're so predictably irrational, we should be able to somewhat predict it at some point in the future, right? To your point, I think we've just scratched the surface, and there's some amazing programs out there that are significantly more clinical that the corporate and commercial environment can definitely take. That's most of the work I do is I take the clinical and I say, that's interesting. How do we apply it just to our corporate initiatives? And it's a great way to kind of put people back in the process. I think we have all these tools and technologies that I absolutely love using. But all of it is to go back to the heart of what we're trying to accomplish, and especially in a commercial setting, around driving growth. So that way we can sustain the existing workforce or grow the existing workforce, pushing innovation and some of the projects, even on the public sector that we're kind of starting to work on, creating blue zones, driving preservation first economic development plans, some of those elements that are just super interesting to kind of say, we're at the end of the day, we're human. So let's just figure out how we human.
Well, look, you are successfully combining psychology and marketing. What would be some of the lesser known psychological triggers that marketers could leverage to create a stronger connection with their audience?
I think it's not necessarily the lesser known. It's more about the trick of when to use what. That's the biggest lesson learned I've kind of going into. You can use the primacy effect or anchoring, where you kind of, and the lawyers would know the anchoring effect, because it's, you take a particular idea and then you build off of that, and then you build off of that, and so on. Or the first mover advantage, or some of these. I think if you pick 5 or 6 and probably start with something like the levers of influence, that would be a really good one to start off with. And then the trick is figuring out what lever to pull when. If you're dealing with particular personalities, that's another element of behavioral science. Sometimes it's not necessarily just the information that you need to push out. It's the way that that person is going to receive it. And that's the more important part of this. So you've got to kind of work your way backward and say, well, if I do these elements around it, I do a lot of priming and framing. That's kind of my more skilled one, and transparently one that I didn't realize I was doing until I started learning a lot of these elements to say,
Okay.
which is which is very common for a CMO. Narrative and positioning is one of our key elements. But there's so many of other ones that you can kind of work through and organize. I think the bigger component there is let's figure out which one do we use at what point in time. And it all depends on who your audience is and what do you think they're going to absorb first and best.
Right. And so is there a framework that you use when you're assessing that?
I do. And it kind of depends on if I'm talking to a business owner or a marketing department. Um, w- Within my CMO services, I kind of break things out into what I call as gaps. So it's goals, analytics, psychology, and the story. So the psychology is really where we do the investigative process of what elements do we want to go into, but you can't get to that until you do the analytics to say how are people currently behaving and
Yeah.
why do we think that people are behaving in order to kind of position it. And then once you've laid out that model of, all right, these are the effects that I'm going to use, or these are the elements, how am I going to weave that into a story or a narrative is where you kind of put the whole board together. And so I very much do a backwards to forwards approach to say, where do I want to be? And then engineer backward.
You mentioned about the in the fractional CMO, you're wearing a couple of hats at the moment. How did you get involved with the Exec HQ?
So I uh, was in the midst of kind of repositioning our BMG from not necessarily just doing marketing communications elements, but moving into workplace and some of these other elements and really becoming a fully fledged human behavior consulting firm. And I realized, going back to that gaps model, that the story and the narratives no longer fit. I can't be both. I can't offer only marketing services and then claim that I can offer all. And particularly my CMO services just didn't resonate as well. So I went out to find an organization because I didn't want to build one that would work. And I stumbled upon Exec HQ in my search, and it's such a great community to have other C-suites that also do consulting and advisory work at the level that they do it in, and transparently, seeing how others consult is a really good think tank. And there's even more behavioral science elements, I think, in the consulting world than people realize around just how do you get buy-in from a buyer in order for you to give them their best recommendation and then for them to take it. Those kind of elements are common topics that we cover to make sure that we're leading and guiding business owners into the right direction. Because there's just so many different types of businesses and frameworks that you can go into that can be very confusing for mid-sized businesses, which is what Exec HQ specializes in.
And mid-sized businesses, bringing in an outsider at that level can be a very big decision where it's a big impact from a cost perspective. It's a big impact from a benefits perspective. What is it that in Exec HQ you do in terms of, I guess, getting across that first initial barrier or reluctance?
Within Exec HQ, they originally started, which is how I originally started with them, which is really offering fractional CXO services across different types of functions. And in the last 2 years or so, as myself and my colleague Baron Lucas have worked through building other types of elements that kind of show the power of having an advisory level CXO or even an embedded level, which are the two tiers that we kind of use most often. So often, if you're a 10 million to, couple $100 million company, if you're 10 million, you're not going to need something major. You're going to need something to get you from point A to point B. And that's where a lot of our fractional services come in. But what we've done with those is we baked in profit optimization and like very quick turnaround solutions that can get them those shorter wins. And we do that because a lot of our clients come in a less than desirable state. They come with a really big pain point. I'm a $10 million company. For some reason, I'm losing clients and I don't really know why, or I'm we're generating all this revenue and I have no idea why the profit is so low. Those kind of, really existential business problems. And then
Mm-hmm.
we go into, well, let's analyze why. And right now, I think the statistic was, I believe it was Ernest Young, maybe one of the big major firms kind of released that 50% of businesses are holding on to customers that are significantly eating away their profit in large chunks. And if you tell that statistic to 5 different C-suites at different roles, they have different analytics format. My Baron, who's the next CEO and has done so much. He's like, well, that's because they don't have processes or haven't done their 3 to 5 year plan. As a marketer, I'm like, well, that tells me that their customers may not be the ones that they have aren't ideal to their targets. And our operations team tells me that maybe they don't have the same processes for every customer. So you get that wealth of advantage like right off the bat, and then you can go straight into inquiry to say, well, which one of those is it? Because there's only 5 or 6 options it could be, and just get back to the answer and then pivot accordingly. In addition to those that would like to sell off their business, and that's another element that is one of their specialties. And we're entering a period of time where, at least in the U.S., the vast majority of companies in that middle market are owned by a population that is looking to retire.
True, very true. Now, there's been a lot more focus on that, which I would like to actually cover on in a minute. But in my past corporate career, I always was moved into organisations that were underperforming to turn them around. And one of the biggest impediments I found to making the improvements was I won't call it ego, but reluctance to change or concern for change. Often, it might be that there's just a long tail of very unprofitable customers that might only represent 5-10% of the overall revenues, and yet they're accounting for 50% of the losses. And people that have a great fear of letting customers go when they're not a good fit or they're not profitable. The reality is that most don't do the detailed analysis to actually allocate the correct cost to those customers, and they think that they're still profitable and that will have a negative impact on the business. The reality is, by cutting off that long tail, potentially it is sometimes, it's a long tail of very unprofitable customers that only generate a small amount of the revenue. The impact multiply so quickly in terms of the immediate increase in profitability, but then the amount of resources that it frees up across the business in all aspects, because they're not dealing with all of the problems that those customers were bringing, whether it's anything from customer support to very small order size, whatever the case may be. It's so I understand exactly what you're saying when you're bringing programs that have a very quick, immediate, immediacy in terms of the results that they deliver for those mid-sized customers, that companies. It's achievable because often from the inside you can't see the forest for the trees.
Exactly. And sometimes you just need that. You currently have your current business at X EBITDA, and it could be X. And often, actually, we talk about presentation of how we position the data and how we talk about it. We talk about going for that element of, you're currently at, let's say, 3.5 million EBITDA. You could be at 7. I'm like, well, how do I get there? It's like, you remove these 6 clients from your clients and you're done. Oh, we can't do that. Why not? Because especially if you're private equity owned, which a lot of organizations are today, EBITDA is kind of king in that element. So you might as well go through it. But that's really how we go about it, is we identify that there's got to be a balance between the short-term gains and those quick wins that those organizations are going to go into. How do we guide them and get that buy-in so that way that resistance to change is different? And that model is just something that's very aligned to what I do. And that's one of the key reasons I joined Exec HQ and leading kind of their 2025 and onward initiatives from that lens has been a delight.
You mentioned before that in that mid-market area, there's a lot of organisations who the owners, and I guess we'll set aside private equity for the moment, but the owners are at the stage where they're looking to retire or hand over, um, looking to move on and exit the business effectively, whether that's via a sale or otherwise. What are some of the challenges you're seeing there?
Oh, I think the most common one is in that mid-sized market. A lot of those, if we're talking, somewhere between 5 and even 20 million, the vast majority of those businesses still have founder-led growth.
Mm.
That's probably that biggest issue is if you remove the existing founder, there will be no growth. All the customers will leave. And that's one entirely different hurdle that we have to kind of guide through and build leadership, self-sustaining leadership in Word. For companies that are, a little bit bigger than that, it's often this both emotional and monetary discussion to say, what is the amount that you need to leave? And what is the, emotional time you need to be able to leave? So there's this concept of, especially if you've had your business for 5, 10, 15 years, maybe even longer. There's a lot of lifestyle businesses that go through. This becomes, something very near and dear and a core element of themselves. So we do have members that actually go through the coaching and the some of our team members like to call it counseling, to kind of walk them through it and be able to let go of that. And that's kind of part of the process. It takes a very strong amount of empathy to be able to kind of resonate with somebody, and say, this is, you've done so much for this organization and you employ X amount of people that are your responsibility. And if you want those people to continue to do that and to be able to transparently still have employment, you're going to have to start letting things go, because that's one of the things that you take very near and dear to you.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't remember the numbers outside of the U.S., but in the U.S., we are going to go through the largest transfer of wealth within that market.
Yeah.
So, and where it goes is kind of in a variety of places. And then there are some that, don't necessarily want to leave it. They just want to train their next generation to host it. That is actually the minority of narratives right now. The next generation is not wanting to take over their parents' business or what have you. So it's mostly actually a sales process, which would be, if we look back 20, even 30 years ago, that would have been virtually unheard of in this time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We had a business broker talking about exits and exit strategies of businesses on the chat here a couple of weeks ago, and he spoke to a very similar issue where there's two driving forces usually that cause the issues with successful exits, and one is that it's founder-led growth, exactly the same as what you've mentioned, and one of the other issues is a lack of leadership, because the founders expected that the next generation would be coming through and take it over, but they don't have that they don't have that interest, and there's this big hole of capability in the organisation that the founders been holding on to with the hope that they would come into the business and show some interest at some point in time. They just never eventuated, and so the challenge is, really, do you make the decision to try and manage your own way through that and bring capability into the organisation, or do you get help? And 9 out of 10 times they will need help, because they just won't be able to have the capability themselves to be able to build that competency within the organisation. One of the issues
yeah, exactly. In that period of time, and part of this other element is that waiting game. Right. That generation kind of said, oh, I'll just, if I wait until, my son or daughter turns 35 or goes to this corporate ladder and then wants to go into it. Well, you've actually lost some really good years to build that leadership beforehand. So now, a 5 to 7 year plan has turned into 3.
Mm,
And you were already holding and those hats of founder, CRO, customer care officer. Now you've got to also be self-advisor.
mm,
It becomes very, very difficult for those types. And now we have a scrunched period of time because I think between now and 2030 is when the largest batch is going to occur.
mm.
The second is 2030 to 2035. So
And what are you seeing in Exec HQ in terms of the greatest demand or requirement and need for the services? Where is who's raising their hands at the moment?
I think right now we're going through that profit optimization. I think that this entire year of economic uncertainty has put that to the forefront. Um, a lot of leadership development and coaching. Um, the I chaired the international group, so this may be biased, but finding newer markets and newer regions to enter into has been a big catalyst, and probably the one that I personally see as a no duh, but it's just become an interesting conversation to have is having a CEO is not necessarily like having a PMO office or some kind of project management of the business, not necessarily in the business kind of model.
Hmm.
And we call that our chief of staff as a service model. And I know that in the commercial world that has different meanings. There's chief of staffs that are now that were formerly executive assistants that, rightfully need a higher title because what they do is not just the assistant level. There's those that, maybe run project management offices or some of these other elements. And then there's the chief of staff that I think the vast majority of businesses transparently need, which is the private sector equivalent of the chief of staff that the White House has, that a lot of these large governments have, which is that right-hand person to move things forward and go through. I often see two very big narratives when you're in that middle market. Either the CEO is the face of the company and is the founder of and leader of bringing growth, or they are the equivalent to the product or service officer, because
Hmm.
they have been in the world so much that they just know it left, right, and center. But neither of those roles actually know how to do chief of staff without enough training to go into it. Some people get that learning curve, some don't. And I think that's probably the biggest one is whichever of those two you fall into, you're still missing this kind of guiding person who keeps everybody on the train and make sure that we don't lose people as we're heading through these tracks kind of model. And that's a really, really big one. Others that we're actually building out right now is a culture and a organizational health arm from one of our team members. So that's another really interesting one. And then for succession planning is continuing to move forward.
Okay. Okay. It's interesting, isn't it, that almost all of those aspects involve such a heavy underlying component of psychology because it's all about getting people to do things, um, you know, getting things done through other people. Effectively, this component of influence and desire and motivation that sits in underneath there, and the steps that are required. Um, just jumping back into the marketing side again, how deep does psychology run in marketing? And so I know you've got two components. You've got the CMO role, but the insights that you're delivering through BMG now, is there anything that's coming up that's actually really surprising you in terms of the impact that it will have on an organization?
I think this year has been kind of the return to the office aha moment. That's where most of them have come in. And and I'm a big proponent of you do marketing externally and you do marketing internally. And if you don't do it internally, then whatever you're doing externally is reduced in effect by a decent amount of exponent numbers across it. And because your internal team members are those that talk to your customers every single day. They talk to your prospect every day. And if they are not buying your story, if they're not drinking your Kool-Aid, so to speak, your impact is just much harder. There was a study done, I think it was by Culture Amp, where they could actually pinpoint their highest, most profitable, and most highest growing companies in their customer list without looking at anything but their employee experience counts and what those numbers are showing. It's a really, really important element, especially in the age where there's so much data, there's so much conversation around it and technology. But technology is literally the science of creation. If you break that down into root words, it just means you're creating things. So, and people are the people that are creating things. So we've got to get back to like, who are those that are generating and doing the work? Are a lot of our RTO programs are going into, wow, I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that my employees face a 90-minute commute because they have to drop off their son or daughter to daycare before they go. I didn't, and sometimes as a C-suite, and if you've been far enough away from that, or you've had the benefit of having spouses or nannies or additional support to manage that for you, it's hard to kind of understand that until you do the research. And for us one of the particular programs we did, we actually recommended they install a daycare on one of their floors. And the property owner loved it so much, they gave a whole floor to it to open up to the rest of the tenants because it would increase occupancy. But it came into, we heard something to say, it's not the commute that's too long, it's that I have to make so many stops throughout it. And then in our head, I was like, wait, why does this person have to make so many stops? And then we saw that a couple of times. So we run through it, and then we actually went back to the survey to say, hey, because we do it anonymized, so we don't know who it is, but here are some things that we heard. Please give us more detail as to what you mean. And in this particular organization, they had the majority of their employees were parents.
Yeah.
So specifically parents of those in grade school or under. And we did that analysis to say, what do you mean you have so many stops? It's work to office. And they're like, no, I have to go. I live in this particular area. I have to go 20 minutes north to drop off my kid to daycare. And then almost in the opposite direction, I have to go south to come back to the office. And I think it's so easy for someone to say, well, that's what the world was always before. I'm like, yeah, the world was also terrible, in many instances. If you think about, across the board, we've improved society. So for us to just say that's just how we've always done it, that's not true. We have vaccines and all this other technology that can help us be better. So we're going to say that a little commute is going to be the reason why we, make people feel like they're complaining in a reasonable manner. That's a different conversation entirely.
I've got a quote coming into my mind that Steve Jobs was quoted as saying that, customers don't know what they want. We've got to show them. And I think this is one of those cases that, through COVID, through the pandemic, where we were forced to work from home, we've actually shown people what it can be like. And so now when you're talking about bringing people back to work, then it's actually a negative. It's a reduction in their quality of life that they never would have noticed before because it was just the way things were done. It's almost the perfect example of, why do we do things here? Well, we've always done it that way. It's that resistance to change. This has been a forced change that now will become embedded, obviously, for everybody. It was a very interesting personal experience for me. I've always ran geographically dispersed business, so I've always felt quite remote from my work virtually since 2000 since 2000. Since 2000, I've been running geographically dispersed businesses and often worked from an office that wasn't related to my business at all. It was part of the organization, but not part of the business that I was looking after. And so there's this level of remoteness all the way through. I saw the posts on LinkedIn, oh, work from home. It's difficult now. You're challenged. You don't have the community feel and the water, the water cooler chats and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, yeah, what are they talking about? And then I realized that the whole globe has gone into a work mode like I've been working in for the last 20 years. Our business has been fully remote from day one. So since 2015, we've been 100% remote business. And so it was just like the world that I'm used to operating in. The impact, though, for others has been enormous. Have you seen the communication for get back to the office that Amazon did? How would you rate that in terms of employee engagement program?
It's definitely polarizing, which is one thing that you don't want your RTO programs to be. And regardless of how you believe, there is data to show that the human experience needs two people to talk to each other, ideally in a room together. But we live in a globalized society. And transparently, if that was true, then I would never speak to my family that lives in Kosovo. In reality, if that was a legitimate thing.
We wouldn't be having this conversation now.
Right. So there's these elements around, and I talk about it in a blended model. And it depends on what your organization is, what you're looking to accomplish, what your current management style and management team capabilities are, because managing remote, as someone who also runs a remote-only organization, is very, very different than managing in person. And you've got to build those skill sets. And I think actually that's one of the catalysts of RTO campaigns and programs, to kind of say, hey, we've got to bring people back because our managers are struggling to manage people. If that's the only reason, then maybe there's an education option there, especially if you're thinking about, you've got to weigh your other business opportunities around, like, how much is rent on the real estate? What is the new insurance costs? All these other elements. So that's why I kind of look at it from a blend perspective. And transparently, I've actually lost opportunities before COVID because I was a remote organization. And I quote, "You can't run a company virtually," was the comments that and feedback I would receive. And lo and behold, that company actually still exists though today, but that after going remote. But it is one of those, it's a perception, and one that is going to change. I do think that we're going to go into a blended society where there's going to be remote functions, in-person functions, and so on. I also think the uptick in travel, particularly group travel, is going to increase. So that way you can build those emotional connectors. But there isn't necessarily a silver bullet. One remotely can be done just as much as we can go back to it. It just depends on how you do it to make it successful. And I've been working on and off remotely since 2015. So, not about 9 years, entering 10. And then since BMG started, we've been remote only, period. But it's definitely doable. It's just, it requires a different skill set. It requires a different level. And it goes back to, it requires on how you expect people to behave. And my personal thought process is, if you have a team that is being forced to come into the office without a proper communication plan, without the proper models and systems in place to get them to want to come back into the office, you're going to be met with a lot of disgruntled employees. You're going to be met with a lot of malicious compliance, intentionally coming in. And right now we know that the numbers are that if you're working remotely, you're actually more productive. So you may see also a decline in productivity. And that goes back into like how behaviorally thought out a particular office is designed as well. So, if you have open office style, what are you going to get? Everybody in headphones talking on top of each other because they're all in meetings on a Zoom call with their other office in Chicago or New York or Sydney or wherever, because that's really what happens.
Exactly. It's very interesting. I'm fascinated to watch what happens over the next 3 to 5 years with organizations. You know who I have the greatest level of empathy for in this whole COVID and work from home environment that's been forced upon us? Office-based micromanagers. They must be tearing their hair out.
Yeah, I think that there's some other, existential things that definitely need to be taken into consideration, um, especially in the United States. And I know that's both of our two of our markets as well. Um, RTO is also gonna, hurt some particular people like mothers who know that childcare is already expensive and may be forced to be pulled out of the workforce because of it. And that, sets those particular people back. And just historically, there's a 4-to-1 ratio of mothers deciding to pull from the workforce compared to fathers. So that's just a general statistic around that. So there are some things around, will I even have enough of a talent pool in certain regions if I force a return of the office mandate, because the cost of childcare and some of these other elements at least in the US market is quite challenging. I just saw a note around it ranges between $800 a month per child up to $2,000 in by
Oh,
state.
wow.
So, depending on the role, that could be a very large chunk, if not in, if you're in different industries, that becomes unsustainable, which is what will go in. And I think about the next generation of uh, employees who who have basically only worked remotely because they entered the workforce maybe a year or two in, if not entered at all during COVID, learned how to work remotely, and then is hearing that we're reaching record profits and record numbers and so on, and then all of a sudden have this mandate. Transparently, we're seeing a lot of Gen Zs not have enough of the social skills to be to be in the office as well. So you may run into some more problems than you anticipated before you went remote back in 2020.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting that the point about you've got people that are in the workforce that potentially have never, ever worked, that I'm just sort of realizing that now. I've never actually considered that before. You've got people in the workforce that have never worked in an office, worked in an office environment. It's not that they've been pushed out remotely. Yeah, look, there's another side to this too, and I think it's quite a positive side in that for some organisations, there's a real opportunity. There's a real opportunity to get very, very good talent. I know the Australian-based business here, Atlassian, they run Jira and all that type of thing. They came out not long after Amazon said, we want everyone back in the office. They came out and said, that's ridiculous. We don't want people back in the office. Our workforce will remain remote and we'll be looking for remote workers. Now, strategically, that's gold and genius, quite frankly, in that you can see this whole set of very high caliber team that will be in AWS, similar skill sets to what Atlassian are looking for, that they're back to office. Atlassian is saying we're not. We've got a few vacancies available. In terms of about getting very good talent into your organization, I think there's a real opportunity for businesses that choose to remain remote if they can get it right.
The RTO program I was telling you about, their mass exodus was literally all of them going to startups, and taking the pay cut and taking these other elements to be able to have the freedom to work remotely. And unfortunately for my client at the time, it takes them about 10 years to develop an engineer at that seniority level. You lose enough of them, you're basically out of the market for the next 5-6 years easily. But on top of that, in that industry, if you are at that level, you're not working for the company. You're saying that you're working up to Joe so-and-so. And when Joe leaves and then he calls you up for a junior role that they have open, it's not even going to be a question whether or not they're going to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. So the impact across the organization can be very, very dramatic.
Yeah. When 4 of your 10 major engineers leave for startups in the region, it's a scary number, especially if you're kind of neck and neck with 2 other competitors that are in regions that have bigger talent pools.
At what stage were you brought into this process? Was it after the exodus started and to try and stop it, or yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. So
too little, too late?
unfortunately, a lot of them have to figure out that that was an issue before starting. I have had a couple who have tabled the mandate long enough to say we're already getting a massive response from it, and we realize this is probably not the way to go, or at least not the way to do it. So they brought me an early stage, but the vast majority of them come in when there is an exodus
Mhm.
um, throughout it. And it's interesting because it's not necessarily, an exodus in a certain department or what have you. It by the time it rolls up to the chief HR officer, when they realize that they need to hire 3 or 4 more talent acquisition specialists to make up for those team members, that at that point it becomes a stop what you're doing right now before we lose more people kind of conversation. And that's literally what we had to do. Um, because we, this organization actually had gotten to a point where they couldn't manage their existing book of business by the sheer exodus that they had. And then they were already bidding on several
Mm.
multi-billion-dollar opportunities that they needed to increase their talent pool and their employees by at least 20% to be able to make up for that. And they were already 10% negative. So it started out as we know why they're leaving. We just don't know how to fix it. And it became we have to pause.
Mm,
That's what
mm.
we have to kind of say, this is effective immediately. We're going to pause these. So, please don't quit with the message.
And were you able to, going through that process, were you able to actually get anybody to return that had resigned?
We had a percentage that came back in. A lot of them we had one of the major engineers come back, which was amazing, for them because that was one of the first, people that left originally.
Mhm.
Um, and then those that reported up to him that also had left started to kind of trickle back in afterward. But we had gotten to a point where without a mandate, they were getting 75% of people come in 3+ days because of the element that we did. In this instance, we actually renovated all the floors to make it much more behaviorally sound around how we want people to engage in the space and so on. So if you're going to be in a meeting, you have spaces to be in meetings and not the conference rooms that are house 15 people, but only one person can be in it. And some of these other mechanisms that we go in addition to the daycare. So now you're going into the office and you still have the opportunity to be productive and get your things done versus having to spend your 9 to 5, realize that so many people are coming to you, distracting you from getting the things you need to get done, only for you to take your laptop home and then go work another 6 to 9 afterward.
Mm, 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 Interesting, interesting. Look, that's a great outcome to get people being able that have left to come back again. I mean, that really is, in those situations, it would be I mentioned it before, the damage to the business. But when you're in a situation where you can't handle what you've got and it's just absolutely inhibiting growth in any way, shape, or form, and in fact, potentially having to step backwards and watch the business shrink, that's a disastrous situation to be in. And it reminds me of a quote, first and foremost, I think it was Bob Ansett that used to say, first and foremost, we're in the people business. It just rings. I remember watching him speak. Must be, well, it was about 1996 actually, starting to show my age a little bit here, but in Australia, in Sydney, at a large conference that I was at. And it's just stuck with me because it resonated with me, and that, business, as much as we say it's a business and we have this phrase of B2B, it's actually P2P. You're still talking to people. You're still dealing with people. It's people that are making the decisions. Sure, we've got AI involved now in bits and pieces, but when it's all said and done, the business is about the people.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important clarity around as we're seeing artificial intelligence and some of these other things kind of come into play. At least right now, we don't have I used to watch this show called Travelers, and it was people going back into the past because AI had, it wasn't necessarily that AI had taken over, it was that AI was actually doing the right thing, but some radicals were coming back or what have you. And all of their decisions were made off of this director AI model, even down to, pairing partners together. That level of it around, you know, we're not there yet. Hopefully we still have some more free will in our society, by the time we have that kind of technology. But, at the end of the day, people are making those decisions, and they're making emotional ones, regardless of what type of uh, rational discussions that they're having. Um, yeah, I talk about this actually a lot in my research teams around. We know we're looking for information that supports our theory, but we're also looking for information that doesn't support the theory, because otherwise we would have very biased data. So we've gotta kind of do both ends, and even then we list out like the biases at least we're aware of, so that way when we put our documents together, or our debrief sessions together, we can kind of say, oh yeah, I see the bias, so we'll start to kind of filter it through. But we do double blind specifically for that. We do two different groups running the same study together.